Hey everybody, Ryan here. The team and I have been really heads down getting ready for production, but I wanted to do a walkthrough video of the Arsenal app to show you more of what it's like to use Arsenal and hopefully answer some questions. We've also got a trip planned in the next couple weeks to go somewhere a little warmer and demo more of Arsenal in the field. It's currently 0 degrees here in Montana where I live. We've been shooting a lot of stuff around here with snow in it, but we kind of wanted to go somewhere a little warmer and give you some demos in some other situations. So that video should be out in a couple weeks. I'm really sorry it hasn't gotten out sooner. But in the meantime, I wanted to do this walkthrough video. So when you get Arsenal in the mail, it's going to come in a box like this. You're going to go ahead and open the box, and what we have inside is a little welcome card with a URL to download the iOS or Android apps. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and pull Arsenal out of the box, and then it just mounts onto the hot shoe of your camera. So you just push it in like that and it holds tight. And then what you're going to do is, if you grab the box, you can pull this section out here, and underneath we've got three things. So we've got a charger brick, USB charging cable, and then a cable that's specific to your camera. So you can go ahead and pull that out. We'll also have on our site where you can order more cables, so if you lose one or you change your camera or something, or you have more than one camera, you can order those on there. Once you have this, you're going to go on the left-hand side of Arsenal and you're just going to plug this in. So it just pushes in like that, and then you'll also plug it into the USB port on your camera. So once that's plugged in, you're good to go. You just hold the power button down for a second and you'll see this blue LED come on, and then we'll probably add like an animation to the LED, but once it's booted, you can connect to it from your phone. So let's do that. So let's go ahead and connect the app here. So if we open it, you can see that it really quickly connects to Arsenal, and we can hit this button here to get live view. I've set up this little scene here with Legos and kind of some moving water in the background so you can see the live view working. We've broken the app into 4 screens, so let me talk about those 4 main screens. So let me talk about those first. So we've got the smart screen. This is where you would go if you want to have Arsenal suggest settings for you and kind of give you more help. There's the manual screen if you're someone who kind of prefers to kind of take full control. We have a screen specific for time-lapse and then a screen specific for video. Before we jump into these, let me go ahead and show you a few other things. So there's this settings screen where we have kind of all the basic settings. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then we have the focus screen right here. So let's talk about the focusing screen first. So here you can see in the Arsenal app, we've got 3 different types of focusing. We have this single point where I can tap somewhere and then it'll go ahead and focus on that point. Back there. We have multi-point, which allows me to set more than one focus point. And this is especially useful in landscapes where what Arsenal is going to do is, if you're on the smart screen and you set multiple focus points, it's going to estimate the distances to those points, to the object in those points, and then try to optimize the focus position to get those in focus. And if you're in the smart screen, it will also suggest a aperture that tries to capture as much of that in focus as possible. And then lastly, this whole scene option, again for landscape, we'll try and do the same thing as multi-point, but automatically for the close and far things. Arsenal's smart screen is where all the machine learning and AI takes place. So you've got your live view and you've got your constraints. I'll talk about these more in a minute. But what you're able to do is basically go into this screen, and all you have to do is tap the shutter button. And Arsenal is going to do all this analysis behind the scenes and then suggest settings, and it's going to go ahead and change those. And then you get a preview down here that you can really quickly tap on and zoom in to see a full resolution view of the photo you just took. The AI machine learning is really able to analyze the scene. There's a couple steps to that. So the first step is Arsenal's got this live view, so it's constantly pulling frames off the sensor and analyzing them. On the Arsenal hardware, we have a data set of 200,000 high-quality professional photos. So when you take that shot, Arsenal actually looks at the scene that you're currently shooting. It'll take a frame from the sensor, analyze that, and then look into the data set to find similar photos. So it'll take about the top 100 similar photos, and then what it's going to do is look at the settings that were used to take those photos and extract what the photographer was trying to optimize when they took those photos. So for example, if you're taking a water shot or a shot with a lot of water in it, it might realize there's longer exposures in those similar photos. If you're taking a woodsy shot, it might try to open the aperture because that cuts down on busyness. If you've got just a straight up landscape, it might try to optimize sharpness, things like that. So what Arsenal is able to do is it's able to look at the scene that you're shooting and then figure out what things are important to optimize in that shot. So the challenge is we can't just take those similar photos and then directly apply the settings from those to your current shot because the conditions might not be the same. You might have different lighting, you might have different stability, your camera might be handheld versus on a tripod, you might have higher dynamic range, things like that. So the second part of Arsenal's setting suggestion is looking at the constraints of the current scene and then using those to adjust the base settings, we call them, that it gathered from the similar photos, and adjusting those based on the constraints. So you get these new settings that work well in your current conditions, but optimize for things that you're shooting in your scene. So let me walk you through those. So we have a couple things. So the first one is vibration. Arsenal has an accelerometer. So if I pick up my camera and I hand hold it, what you'll notice is it's adjusting based on how stable I'm holding the camera. Now this is nice because most cameras don't have that kind of automatic built-in stability. Actually, I don't think any DSLR or mirrorless cameras do. So what we're able to do is basically set a minimum shutter speed that's required in order to prevent blur from camera shake. What's interesting too is a lot of times you'll even be on a tripod, and even sort of cheaper tripods don't provide enough stability. So Arsenal is able to compensate for that by analyzing exactly how much vibration your camera is experiencing. The next one is scene movement. So if I go ahead and wave my hand in front of the camera here, you'll notice that it's setting a minimum shutter speed based on how much movement is in the scene. What's interesting about that is you might have your camera perfectly stabilized on a tripod, but if you have a fast-moving subject in your scene, say a runner or a car or something, sometimes you'll want to increase that shutter speed so that it freezes that motion. What's interesting with the scene movement constraint is that Arsenal is actually going to look at those similar photos and then possibly ignore the scene movement constraint if the other similar photos have longer shutter times. So for example, if you've got a water scene and there's a lot of movement from water, it might actually ignore that because that scene movement constraint because a blurred water image looks better than one where you've frozen the water in a lot of cases. And so it really comes down to what did it gather from this training set that we have? What was it able to learn and then apply to the current scene? So next we have dynamic range. Well, there's an interesting trade-off in photography where as you increase your ISO, you lose the ability to capture a really bright part of a scene and a really dark part of a scene. So you'll end up where you need to either pick to expose for the bright part or expose for the dark part. And so this trade-off can be kind of quantified here. So for example, I've got these really bright windows in the background of this shot. If I move it to somewhere with less dynamic range, you're going to see that the available ISO that can capture the current dynamic range of the scene goes up. So here it says we could go up to 6400 and still capture. We wouldn't be losing out details because of the decreased dynamic range at those higher ISOs. And if I go ahead and point it back, you'll see it jumps back down because we've got these bright windows again. And so it needs to be able to be shot at a lower ISO to capture all that detail. Now obviously Arsenal, when it goes to compute settings, sometimes it's still got to trade that for other things, but having that quantified is useful in our calculations. Color range is kind of the same thing except for color. So if color accuracy kind of drops as you increase your ISO. So if I point this at something, say over here, where there's really not a lot of color detail in this particular scene, you'll see it goes up to 6400 again to say like you're not going to be losing color accuracy because of in this current scene. Now if I point it back at these Lego figures here I've set up, they actually have some really detailed color that you would lose in this particular scene. So having that color range adjustment is useful as well. And then the last two are Depth of field. So this comes if you set a multi-point or whole scene focus point. Arsenal is going to look at the distances between those points and decide what's the minimum aperture required to actually get all of those in focus. So that's useful for more landscape photography. And then the last one is lens sharpness profile. So we have a data set on most lenses that are out there, and we can look at what lens you're shooting with and then look into our data set, and we can look up how sharp it is at different apertures. So there's some trade-offs there that go into computing where certain apertures are sharper. So as you get towards wide open, things tend to get a little softer, and then as you stop all the way down, things get softer, less sharp, because of an optical property called diffraction. So Arsenal is able to basically weigh all of these constraints in real time, and then when you go to take the shot, it automatically calculates everything and then takes that shot and adjusts the settings right away and then takes the shot. So I ended up going into quite a bit of detail about what Arsenal does when you take a photo. As an end user though, you just push the shutter button in the smart screen or put it in handheld mode and let Arsenal do its analysis. We worked really hard to try and take a lot of the guesswork out of photography and make it easy for anyone to get out there and get really great images. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the manual screen here. For those of you who like a little more control, the manual screen really gives you the options to, treat Arsenal more like a remote. So I can say here, if I want to increase my aperture, for example, and then decrease my shutter speed, and kind of dial all that in. You also have right here is the mode button for the camera itself. So these are the camera's modes. So here I could set, I want to do aperture priority, for example, and then instead of adjusting shutter, I can adjust exposure compensation and things like that. Again, the settings you're adjusting here are exposure compensation, shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO. And then again, at any point I can go ahead and take a photo. It's going to go ahead and focus, and then I get my preview down here. A couple other things I want to show. If we go to the settings screen, I'll talk through some of these, but there's a couple useful ones that I think would be good to demo here. We have a couple grid options. So if you want to say, like, if you want to have some grids over your shot, we have, rule of thirds, golden ratio, things like that. We're going to add a few more to these. The next thing is Arsenal lets you do focus peaking on any of our supported cameras. So here, I don't know if you can see, but what's in focus currently is actually being highlighted in red. So if I focus back here, you'll see that there's no longer red around these objects, and then if I focus back, you'll see it kind of highlights them in red. We'll work on making that a little more obvious, but it's kind of useful to be able to glance and see, especially if you're manually focusing or something. Having that focus peaking is really useful. The next thing that we have is zebra stripes. So for this example, I've got really bright windows behind me, and you can see that it adds these stripes to where things are being overexposed. Again, this is more of a pro feature, but it's kind of useful. I'll talk quickly too about the triggers here. So the standard trigger is single shot, so that's just when I push the shutter button, it does a trigger. We also have a time delay. So right here you can see it starts at 5 seconds, but I can go ahead and adjust that. Say I want to set it to 3. I can go ahead and select that. I can hit start, and then you'll see a countdown, and it'll take the shot. We also have these bulb modes. So there's bulb hold, which allows you to basically hold down the shutter button. When you push it down, it opens the shutter. When you release it, closes it. And then hold tap, where you tap it to start, and then you tap it again to stop. So the time-lapse screen, like the other screens, has this live view up here. And then your two main options are your interval. So this is how big is the gap between shots. So I might say I want to take a shot every 10 seconds, or I want to take a shot every 42 seconds, something like that. And then the second one is how many shots do I want to take. So you can go down to as little as 2 and as many as, I think we do 10,000 here. What's nice is we've got these What's nice is we've got these little views right here that show you how long your time lapse is going to run for. So based off number of shots, for example, and the interval, I can see that if I did this many shots, it would run for 28 minutes. And then the second thing you get is this play time. So based again on this is solely based on the number of shots. I can see how many shots do I need to get 11 seconds, for example, at 24 frames a second. So with Arsenal's Holy Grail features, we wanted it so that it was easier to do these day-to-night time lapses. This has traditionally been a very hard thing to do, and in our experience, the tools out there just aren't that good. So the way Arsenal actually does Holy Grail is a little different from a lot of the other tools out there. It's more similar to what you might have in your camera, where after each shot, Arsenal needs to calculate the exposure for the next shot. And so the way we do that is we look at the previous couple shots, and we run an auto exposure algorithm that we created on them. So we're able to look at those shots and say, okay, this one's a little bit underexposed, the next one's more underexposed, and then we can basically use that to predict what the exposure for the next shot will be by adding in some velocity and some smoothing. Now what the Holy Grail settings let you do is basically say how you want Arsenal to change the settings as the light changes. So for example, in this situation, we'll come back to the EV, but in this situation I might say, okay, I want a shutter speed between 1/30th of a second and 5 seconds. And then what's going to happen is, as it gets darker, the shutter speed is going to get longer and longer and longer until it gets to 5 seconds, and then it's going to jump to my next set of settings. So I might say I want ISO 64 up to ISO 3200. And then it's going to go up and up and up, after each time it goes up on the shutter, and then it's going to hit that, and then it might bump up my next setting. So I could say, if I don't care about the aperture changing, I can set it like this. If I do care, I can actually just lock it down to a specific value. And then one of the nice things is, depending on what type of time lapse you're doing, you might want things to change differently. So I could go in and really easily say, I always want the shutter speed to be at a fixed shutter speed. I do this for time lapses sometimes where I'm time lapsing water, and what I want is I want that shutter speed to stay the same. So I can go ahead and drag this down, and I can put that at the bottom, for example. And then I can say, I want to adjust my ISO first, and then I want to have it adjust the f-stop. Now while your time lapse is running, you're going to get a preview up here. You can actually go in and say, I feel like it's getting a little dark or a little bright or something if the exposure isn't doing quite what you wanted. And you can do this sort of live exposure compensation. So if you adjust this up, Arsenal over the next few frames is actually going to go ahead and slowly ramp towards your adjustment. And so this lets you kind of have a little more control, but still is still simple to use and kind of gives you that smooth transitions without too much work. Let me go ahead and do a quick time lapse here. I'll show you one of my favorite features. So if we start the time lapse, it's going to go ahead and focus, and then it's going to give us this progress animation down here, where you can see the solid line is the exposure time, so this is when the shutter is open, and then the dashed line is the interval. Up here we get this progress bar that shows us how many shots we've taken, the amount of time recorded, and then the amount of time left. And then as we're shooting, we're getting these previews being pulled in for each of the shots. You can see down here we could go ahead and tap and kind of zoom in and check our details. But my favorite feature, if we give this another minute, here I'll do a few things to kind of make this interesting. Okay, so my favorite thing here is that as it's shooting, it's pulling in these photos. So we can go ahead and at any point hit this preview button, and it's going to actually generate a video for us and let us preview the time lapse that we've shot up until this point. This is really useful. I find a lot of times as a time lapser, you'll actually leave when things are getting good, or you'll because you can't judge that motion without actually seeing it. Or sometimes you'll have things like sea spray on the lens or dust spots on the lens or something. So being able to preview this is really useful. It also lets you kind of make better decisions about when to leave, when to recompose, things like that. You can actually just go ahead and stop the time lapse whenever, and again you can preview what you have up until this point. Takes a few seconds to generate, and then you can preview it. And again, we can go ahead and go in and we can see all the shots that we've taken up until this point. You know, we can flip through them, and we can quickly flip through them and see what we've got. You know, I kind of forgot to mention too, you know, Arsenal has this whole system of caching so that photos are downloaded onto the Arsenal and then resized on Arsenal and then sent to your phone, so that you really quickly get these previews, and then these larger versions are sent. They're cached on Arsenal. We have a bunch of flash memory on it, and then they're also cached on your phone. So the end result really is, you know, you get where you can really quickly flip through your photos just like you would on your phone, and you know, then you can kind of go back, and as this gets longer, you can flip through it as well. You can also do things like you can delete a photo, you can rate them, and then you can. Lastly, there's the share option. So if I wanted to, I could take any of these photos and go ahead and, you know, share it on Instagram or anything like that. Facebook, any of the apps that you can normally share from on your phone. On certain cameras, Arsenal is able to start and stop video as well. So here we have the video screen. It's fairly simple. We're going to be expanding this in the future, but you've got your manual settings here, a timer for how long the video is played, and then down here you can press the trigger button to start recording. On some cameras too, we're able to actually show you the live view here. So you can actually, on certain cameras, you can see the live view while it's being recorded. You get the amount of time it's recorded, and you can hit stop here. We don't have this yet, but we will also be adding where you can watch back your videos as well in the preview section. Arsenal has 3 different what we call stacking modes. These are ways of taking more than one photo and combining the data from those photos into a new photo that captures data you would have lost in a single exposure. So let me go ahead and jump in and I'll talk about that. If we go to the settings here, you can see here we have our 3 different stacking modes. We've got exposure bracketing, focus stacking, and long exposure stacking. Let me talk about exposure bracketing first. What exposure bracketing lets you do is capture details in high dynamic range scenes that you would have lost in a single shot. So a lot of times you'll have a really bright object in a scene, say the sun or a light or something like that, and then you'll have a darker area in the scene, say like a shadow in a foreground. And on most cameras, they still don't have enough dynamic range in a single shot to capture all those details. So you typically have to pick one or the other. You have to either expose for the highlights or expose for the shadows. What exposure bracketing lets you do is combine more than one shot. So you might have Arsenal take, say, an overexposed photo, a correctly exposed photo, and an underexposed photo, and then combine those together to create a new photo that captures all those details. So let me show you what this looks like. So here we've got our exposure bracket settings. We can choose to have Arsenal automatically take an exposure bracket when it determines that's necessary. So before you take a shot, Arsenal is going to look at the scene, analyze the dynamic range, and if that's higher than what your camera can handle, it'll do an exposure bracket. If you want to have more control over that, you can go to Fixed and choose the settings that you want. So here I can say I want 3 shots, and let's do 3 steps apart. So if we go back, you can run this in either the smart or the manual screen. And I go ahead and trigger my shutter. What it's going to do is it's going to take those 3 photos, one after the other, at different exposures. So here you can see it's doing a correctly exposed photo, an underexposed photo, and then an overexposed photo. So what Arsenal is doing here is it's pulling in the 3 files. It's going to go ahead and download them to the Arsenal hardware, and then on the hardware it's going to process them and give us out a new merged file. Now that file gets written back to the SD card, or we can view it here. Now the nice thing is we can immediately click on it and check that everything looks good. You'll notice that there's a lot of details in the merge shot that weren't there in the original. If we look at the original, you can see we're missing some details here, and there's some extra shadow detail that you wouldn't have otherwise. Focus stacking, instead of changing the exposure, changes the focus position between shots. So sometimes you'll have an object that's really close to the lens and really far away, and you want to get both of those in focus at the same time. Lenses have limited depth of field, but the real challenge is if you stop all the way down so that your aperture captures more depth of field, as you get towards those higher aperture numbers, the lenses tend to get softer due to an optical property called diffraction. So if you want to maintain that sharpness, focus stacking is a great way to keep everything in focus without sacrificing sharpness. It's something that's done very commonly in landscape and macro photography. Let's go ahead and take a look here. You can see we have our focus stacking options again. Again, we have auto, where Arsenal will do some data analysis to decide whether or not it should focus stack, or you can manually specify how many shots you want to take. I'm going to go ahead and do 4 shots here. And the more you do, the more kind of in focus you capture. So there is kind of a right amount, and auto is pretty good at figuring that out for you. But if you want to do it manually, you can also specify. So let's go ahead and take the shot, take the set of shots. It's going to go ahead and adjust the focus position during each shot to capture all the details in the scene. Again, once it's taken those shots, it's going to pull them in, align the photos so that, because a lot of times with focus stacking, the act of moving the focus position actually changes the edges of the shot a little bit, and then merge them together. So here you can see it went ahead and merged those, and we've got our details where the battery is in focus, the board's back here, and then the background. And again, if we wanted to capture more in focus, we'd have to increase the number of shots. But you can kind of let auto do that for you if you don't have the time to experiment. Lastly, let's look at the long exposure stacking. This one's a little hard to demo in my home office, but we'll try and get you some more real-world demos here pretty soon. What the long exposure stacking is useful for is making longer exposures than you could normally take without an ND filter. So by combining the exact same shot over and over again, and then averaging the pixels of those shots, we're able to create this long exposure effect that gives you basically the same shot as if you'd taken a much longer exposure, and again without ND filters. So here we can go to our settings. Again, we can choose auto or fixed. In this case, I'm going to do 5 shots. And so basically what that's going to do is multiply our exposure time by 5. So here if we trigger the shot, you can hear it really quickly, one after the other takes all these shots. And then again, it's going to pull them in, merge them together, and then you can quickly see this full res merge shot. It's a little hard to tell. This is not the best example in the world, but here you can see it's extending the time on this water. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what it's like to use Arsenal. We think we've built something that really makes photographers' lives easier and helps them get better shots. Arsenal's AI ensures you get those optimized settings. The stacking modes help push your photos past what's possible in a single exposure. The manual screen gives you full control remotely, and if you're into time-lapse, we think we've built the best time-lapse tool out there. The team and I will be heading out soon to shoot more demo footage of Arsenal in the field, and we should have that out in a few weeks. Thanks, everybody.